Welcome to Trust Talk. In this episode, we meet Joe Hamm, a trust scholar from the School of Criminal Justice from Michigan State University, exploring his research in criminal justice, policing, and environmental health. Joe shares insights on how trust and vulnerability shape the public's relationship with law enforcement, distinguishing between internal and external harm in policing. He discusses how trust impacts people's responses to environmental contamination, particularly in the case of Dow Chemical in Michigan, where trust can lead to riskier behaviors. Joe also highlights the importance of bridging the gap between academic research and practical applications, advocating for interdisciplinary efforts and communication channels. The conversation concludes with Joe's perspective on challenges in trust research, including the balance between trust and trustworthiness. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Joe, welcome to Trust Talk. It is great to have you with us, especially knowing you are not only a long-time listener of the podcast, but also a renowned trust scholar. So, to kick things off, could you share what sparked your interest in focusing so much of your academic work on trust?
Absolutely. Well, first I want to say thank you for the invitation. I actually discovered Trust Talk on a couple of cross-country road trips I used to take with my dog. It was a super welcome companion, so I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute. In terms of my own road to trust, I've always been fascinated by the elements of our social life where we ask specifically trained government actors to interact specifically with the public. So when I started graduate school, that was all about jury decision making. I thought of that as this really clear example of this specially trained courtroom work group that's being asked to work with this rotating cast of the public to accomplish this really technical task of adjudication. But one of my first jobs as a graduate student was to find a measure of trust. So I had been assigned to work with a team that was trying to figure out how best we could reduce failures to appear in court. And they asked me to find a measure of trust. We thought this was going to be quick, just something we were going to add to the project. But it actually ended up taking us about 5 years to make sense out of what we really thought trust was and how best it could be measured. A lot of that work is still going on right now from a lot of the people of that team that have now distributed to other places.
You're part of the School of Criminal Justice, so let's focus on that field today. We've talked about how vulnerability is key to trust. Can you share what led you to look into how the public perceives potential harm from police actions like misuse of authority or excessive force? And tell us a bit about your main findings, especially regarding how various communities view this issue.
Absolutely. So when I started at MSU, I'd actually done most of my work up to that point in the courts context. And I still do a bit of that work. But one of the huge opportunities that came with joining this department in particular is that it has this really long history of working with policing. And so without saying that the relationship between the public and the courts is any less important, because it really isn't, policing just offers this context where the gap between governance and the public is just really small. I mean, people can think quite a bit about their relationship with law enforcement. In a lot of ways, the police kind of are the face of the government for a lot of people. So in that literature, one of the main constructs they talk about is usually legitimacy rather than trust. And so one of my main interests has been trying to understand what makes trust different. So legitimacy is usually thought of as the perception that authority should have power, because that power necessarily creates some vulnerability between the public and the police. Seeing the police as legitimate does mean that we're accepting some level of harm. But trust really shifts that focus, right? It shifts specifically to being not thinking about the authority. It's more focused on that potential for harm itself. So we would expect trust and legitimacy to correlate, but not be the same thing. So making that a little bit practical. If trust is about this willingness to accept that the other person has some control over our experience of harm, it really seems to be important what kinds of harms matter. I mean, there's a lot of things the police could do that could hurt us, but we're probably not worried about all of them all of the time. So our work in the policing context really started with trying to see if this version of trust as rooted in vulnerability might actually play in that context. And like you've heard from across the sessions that you've recorded, it does. Vulnerability does seem to be an important part of trust across contexts. But what we wanted to do was to pose kind of a really basic division of the kinds of harms we might experience from the police. We create law enforcement primarily to protect us from external harm that's external to that relationship, what we typically think of as criminal behavior. What we're hoping for in most contexts is that the police will address our vulnerability to harm that's beyond that relationship, that's from other people. But when we empower law enforcement to handle those vulnerabilities, we necessarily increase the odds they might directly hurt us, what we call internal harm. And so the projects that you're talking about here really focused on trying to make sense of, are those two types of vulnerabilities different? Do they look different for different people? And do they have different relationships with trust? And so the first study, I guess the second of that 3-study sequence, we compared whether individuals who identify as white feel differently as compared to individuals who identify as Black or as Muslim. And we picked those groups specifically because, at least in the US, but to an extent internationally, those are groups that often experience different types of policing, tactics in some cases, but definitely different relationships. And as you would expect, our white respondents are less concerned kind of across the board. We do also see a little bit of difference between Black and Muslim participants. But what was really stark, at least to me, is that when you put that concern about internal harm, so the harm the police themselves could cause someone, and you compare it to the harm that people believe that crime could cause, that the police are supposed to control, that external harm, that fear of crime, doesn't predict trust. Trust is based on whether or not you think you are protected from the vulnerabilities the police control, the behaviors that they could actually engage in towards you. What we seem to be finding there is some difference in how people think about these vulnerabilities, but also different roles in what those vulnerabilities mean for our ultimate trust.
So how do your findings about trust in policing align with similar studies from other countries? And can you discuss any universal themes or notable differences? And if I may, in relation to that, how has the public trust in the police changed over the years? So tell us a bit about the impact you see that your research may have had on this evolution.
So I'll be completely honest and say that all of my research to this point is focused within the US context. And so anything that I'm saying kind of beyond that is a little more speculative, but I do think there's some grounds for that speculation. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to try. If my work has something to say to that, what it has to say is that this idea of the vulnerabilities that matter most for trust in the police are probably not consistent. They're probably not consistent across countries, but there's even less reason to think they would be consistent within countries. When I talk with people about their trust in the public, it becomes very clear very quickly that for some people, when they think about harm that the police could cause, what they mean is, I might be speeding, validly pulled over, and then be late to wherever I was going. But some people are worried that no matter what they do, the police might show up and kill them. Those are very different vulnerabilities they feel, and they require very different things from the police to address them. Your question about the change in trust in the police over time, there are a number of international and national studies that have tracked things like trust in major institutions across geographic or different political areas. I've not yet found what I think is a consistent trend there. So you do see some dips in places, you do see some flat lines in places, some upward, some downward trends. But what I do see as a theme across those is, at least in my own mind, a mismatch between the way the police think about the vulnerability they generate and the vulnerability that the public feels that they generate. People are talking about this bad apples argument, that there are just some bad officers that manage to get into an otherwise good basket. If the police conceptualize the vulnerability there as, we need to find the problematic actors and remove them from law enforcement, which is super important. If you go into a community talking about the new measures you have for detecting these problematic officers, and that community is worried that policing is systemically problematic, you're not talking to the same vulnerability. And there's no reason why they would walk away from that saying, we are now more protected. You've missed what they were concerned about. And you don't have to weigh in on whether they're right to be able to understand that they're saying something different than what law enforcement is. And that mismatch seems to pervade a lot of conversations.
Joe, you explored how the public perceives and trusts the police, focusing on what you just mentioned, the vulnerability and the risk from police actions. In a previous interview with Roger Meyer, he told us how he researched the opposite, how the police can trust the public. How do you see your findings interacting with this perspective?
Absolutely. So this question of the police's trust in the public, I think, is a super important one and a direction that's much needed across that literature. So I was super excited to see Roger and Scott and that group's work in that area. As I think about it, unlike the relationship between the public and the police tend to be very comfortable or seem to be very comfortable talking about how they don't trust the public. So obviously that's not about the average person. It's not that the average officer would say the average person is not trustworthy, but they're pretty quick to talk about the ways they could be harmed in the job and the fact that they don't feel willing to accept those vulnerabilities. And in the US in particular, there is good reason to think that one of the preoccupations of law enforcement is this idea of threat, is this constant idea I could be hurt, I'm at war, I'm constantly going out there and trying to protect myself, just make it sure that I make it home safe at the end of the day. And on a lot of levels, that makes a lot of sense. If someone is a genuine threat, we don't want an officer just to trust them not to do anything. We want them to intervene. The challenge, though, is when that gets generalized to people who don't deserve it. And that's a really challenging problem for law enforcement. So we actually submitted an unsuccessful grant proposal years ago, trying to distinguish this idea of generalized distrust towards the public from valid caution. But I have seen a few other attempts in the literature, but it's really challenging to think about how to help police understand that we want them to trust the public, but not too much. We want there to be this assumption that this person could have good intentions, but not that they would fail to respond to bad intentions. And I really think that the more successful stuff in this space is going to be focusing less on building police trust in the public and more on helping police shed this idea of constant threat, this warrior mentality, this idea that everything is always threatening. Not all officers have by any means, but it is something that pervades that institution. And once you can get that feeling of threat and that feeling of vulnerability a little bit more calibrated, I think you open up the opportunity to have conversations about why is that trust and not valid caution? When are you able to say, I think this person is well motivated and I don't need to intervene right now?
Joe, when preparing for this interview, I studied many of the articles that you sent me, and the thing that struck me immediately is you have had basically two areas where your research focused on. The police, like you just explained, but also another subject that I would like to cover now, and that is environmental contamination. At first sight, these things have not much in common. Maybe you can explain a little bit about that, but let's talk about that subject. You and your colleagues wrote in the Journal of Risk Research about the research into dioxin contamination in Michigan waters.
Yes.
You are touching a tricky point about trust. Sometimes when people really trust those in charge, they might end up taking more risks instead of being cautious. This is because they feel that the authorities are handling any dangers, making them feel safer to do things that might actually be risky. So how did that play out in the contamination by Dow Chemical in Michigan?
Absolutely. So firstly, thank you for looking through the articles. They're a lot of fun to play with this idea of trust in different contexts. And some of that has been a bit opportunistic, where I have relationships that it makes sense to explore it. But it has been somewhat systematic. Moving from the courts to the police was about that closer relationship, was about somewhere where people could really think about what it meant to have a relationship with law enforcement. Moving into this public health context has opened up this opportunity to think about health outcomes. And so when we're talking about positive relationships with governance, it's a little easier to think about how that actually plays in people's health in the environmental context. And so moving around a little bit has created these opportunities to take ideas, things that we're able to develop because of the policing context, and apply it to a new context. Also identify some new impacts of what trust could mean and take those to other places. Setting all of that aside, though, Midland, Michigan, super fascinating place to do trust research. So the whole state of Michigan's really been no stranger to the complexities of being an industrial kind of Rust Belt community. But there are a few pockets of the state that have been really protected from that. And often that's the result of the major industry in those areas not being connected to the auto industry. So in Midland, the major employer there is Dow Chemical. And in general, that community has a super positive view of DAO, and it's for really good reason. It's a huge contributor to the local community, both in terms of jobs, but they do a massive amount of philanthropy in that community. They really, really do care quite a bit about it. Now, historically, DAO has had a hand in some pretty significant environmental contamination, especially of the river that flows out of that city. But again, given those community values and some public and legal pressure as well, but they really do recognize that they caused that contamination or had some hand in it. And they are currently paying to have all of that remediated. They're working with the state and with the federal government to get that fixed. So to your more direct question, you can imagine in this community where this really trusted company has some role to play in this contamination that has happened and is taking the central role in remediating it. The more you trust them, the more likely you are to either think they're effectively handling this problem or to think that there really was no problem in the first place. This could not have possibly been an issue from the start. That is exactly what we find in the paper that you were talking about. But what was really stark for us is that we could trace that change in trust through to whether or not people actually engaged in protective behavior that was objectively important for keeping them safe. This was not causal by any means, but we were able to find an association where people who had more trust in DAO felt the situation was less risky and thus were more likely to engage in a particular health challenging behavior. What we were looking at was consumption of local fish that are likely to carry that contamination just based on their own feeding practices. So bottom feeding fish in particular, predator fish, are more likely to accumulate these dioxins within them and are more likely to expose people who eat them. That difference in trust that people who do have more trust in DAO see less risk makes total sense. But being able to actually trace that all the way through to this question of how people keep themselves safe, I think was the major contribution there.
A recurring theme in your publications, it seems, is on how much people trust organizations like the EPA, local government, and companies like the one you just mentioned, Dow Chemical, especially when they handle environmental issues, like you mentioned. How does this trust affect the way people see and respond to what these organizations do? So, extended to what you just explained about Dow, but also other agencies.
Oh, absolutely. I think that the centerpiece there is that the tasks these organizations are doing, these institutions are doing, they're complicated. If we think specifically about environmental contamination, we can't see most of the problem. And at least I, even having been around this area and studying it, I have really fairly little understanding of how much of which contaminant it's going to take for me to be hurt. Most of this really is a probability game. There aren't that many things that we can be exposed to that will necessarily make it into our bodies and then necessarily cause us harm. So when does that risk of exposure or that risk that the exposure causes harm get to the point where we really need to do something about it? And at what point does trying to prevent any level of risk actually cause more harm than allowing that low level of unlikely risk to kind of float around in the background? And that's the whole reason we have these organizations. We task them with these things like keeping us safe from crime or keeping us safe in the environmental health context, because we need help making those decisions. But because we usually can't really make sense of whether they're doing the right things all the time, whether there's a better way to do this, whether they're accepting an acceptable amount of risk, in the end, it really does come down to whether we trust them.
I faced a significant challenge in the field of trust after numerous interviews. The limited interaction between trusts, scholars, and practitioners. So how, in your view, can we encourage better collaboration and, more crucially, ensure they truly listen to each other?
Well, first, I think Trust Talk is a great step in that direction because it creates this opportunity to have media that people are familiar with, this idea of podcasts that they're able to sit down with if they're driving across the country with their dog and make some sense out of where both practice and the research around trust are at the moment. And so first, thank you. I think what you're doing is a huge step in that direction. I also think that the first International Network of Trust meeting where we met over last year, I think there's an opportunity there as well to bring more practitioners in, and that's something that organization is thinking about and thinking about better ways to do that. The Journal of Trust Research that I edit is also starting some practitioner pieces where the idea there is to create this how to get research in a context and in a format that is helpful on the practitioner side as well. I'm hoping that there will be an opportunity there for that to be bi-directional and that we'd be able to bring both perspectives into it. But at least there is this move towards media that people are familiar with, that they're able to easily get access to, that I think is a really important part of this. The other thing that I would say, though, is the opportunity to expose people before they've really made that decision about researcher or practitioner that we're talking about here. As you get into those areas, it becomes really difficult to bridge some of those gaps. And so if you have spent 20 years in practice, there's areas about the research that are just a little less important for what you're doing, but maybe could have some impact if they were framed in a way that would help you. It's also really easy to get stuck in these ivory towers of academia and ignore the practical context of what we're doing. But where you can get students in particular that are moving to try and make those decisions about, do I want to be in practice? Do I want to be in academia? When you can get them in the same room and you can push on their thinking, they're in this really moldable state. They're in this opportunity where you put a political science student with someone who ends up working for a state Supreme Court, and the opportunity they have to change how they think fundamentally about these issues, I think is huge. And it's something I'm hoping that the Trust Lab that we've started at MSU is able to do, is able to help students get this interdisciplinary, but also cross academic and practitioner kind of context all at the same time, while they're still open to the idea of thinking differently and aren't 20 years down the road and very entrenched in whichever side they picked.
Basically, what you just said is a precursor to the question I'm always ending my interviews with, and that is, what are, in your view, the major challenges in trust research for the next decade or the next young researchers?
I really appreciate this question, and it's a fun one to have listened to across your previous recordings. As I think about the big questions in trust research, they kind of flow from two of the things that I think we really know about trust, or at least feel that we know. So one of them is that trust is associated with pro-social outcomes. Talk about this all the time. This shows up in constant, like everyone's paper, everyone's argument. Trust is about pro-social stuff. And we also talk about how trust comes from our relationships. So we trust the people that we think deserve our trust. So what I would argue the big questions are is where those two things break down. So on the antisocial side of this, if we trust someone, we're able to let go of this idea that we feel vulnerable. And that's something that we want to protect. And so we try really hard to maintain our trust for as long as we possibly can so we can avoid feeling vulnerable about things. But there's some question of how far we're prepared to go and how much we're prepared to ignore to maintain that feeling of trust. There are a number of contexts in which you'll see people respond to challenges like policing, like environmental contamination. They'll challenge the organization or the institution meant to protect them. And you'll hear a response that is, I can't stop trusting them. I can't deal with the fact that you feel vulnerable, because if I get rid of that institution or change that institution or dramatically change the situation, I now feel way more vulnerable. And so I'm prepared to accept antisocial outcomes because it protects my feeling of vulnerability. There's a wonderful piece by Liz Jackson looking at how universities take their vulnerability to financial challenges and actually translate that into increased vulnerability for non-tenure stream faculty. And her answer, and I think the only answer here, is that it requires some level of courage in that group that is feeling vulnerable to be able to experience some of that vulnerability and not just keep pushing it downstream, just making another group of people more vulnerable. Thinking about that, where trust comes from in the relationship, the question that I think stands out to me there is what to do when we have trust but no trustworthiness. And I think here in particular about charismatic leaders, in particular ones who may have more problematic track records. If we trust them, we must feel that they are the best place to put our vulnerability. And that might simply be because they understand, because they're the enemy of our enemy, number of other reasons why they might think that vulnerability is best accepted there. But there's questions to be asked about how to foster a well-calibrated trust where people who are objectively able to manage our vulnerability are also perceived as the ones most capable of protecting our subjective experience. And then how to get people to think about contexts where there is a lot of vulnerabilities that are relevant. Here, I think about the genuine vulnerability to losing control over whether or not we personally want to vaccinate and its nexus with the idea of how that impacts public health. There are very different implications there. And while we may want to be able to protect ourselves on one side from a vulnerability that we feel, that I would argue is maybe a bit smaller, it's being balanced against this larger social public health vulnerability. And how do you get people to be able to look past the vulnerability they most saliently feel and see these larger, bigger, society-wide vulnerabilities that they're smaller? I recognize I'm making a value statement by calling it smaller, but they're smaller vulnerabilities back up against.
Joe, that's a wonderful ending of our conversation. I'm sure that there is a lot more to research on trust. But I think the ultimate goal of your work and my work is that there will be eventually a common understanding about what trust does, how we can repair it, how we can restore it, what it does in our lives. And so your contribution, especially on the policing and the other fields, the contamination and other public-private trust issues, is very wonderful start for that journey. So I thank you very much for that, and also for being available for the Trust Talk podcast.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you for all your work.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.